Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist Third Worldist Collective. Someone asked me on YouTube, I think it was 2 days ago, what would be the motivation for work in a communist society? And my response was simple: collective ownership by workers. That's it. I have had these kinds of discussions with people for a long, long time. And whenever I give that response, I never get a response back. Never. What are they going to say? Capitalists generally uh, have this idea that somehow communism or socialism is based on the idea of handouts. In other words, people simply get something for nothing. Of course, that is not true. I mean, any communist knows that is not true. That communism is based on the idea of the workers, the workers, people who work. It's not based on the idea of getting handouts. Now, obviously, there are going to be poor people, I would assume. There are going to be people who are poor because they can't work, because they are bedridden, because they are housebound or something like that. And of course, people like that will need to be taken care of. But they don't need an incentive to work because they can't work, right? So an incentive wouldn't matter. I mean, if somebody is bedridden, you can give somebody all the incentives that you want. It's not going to make that person able to work. It's not going to allow that person to get out of the bed into the office. Now, perhaps there might be some kind of work that a person like that could do. I don't know, maybe. I'm not an expert on different types of work that people can do from bed, but I know, um, having seen both my mother and my father, who have now been deceased for a long time, when they were bedridden, I mean, they literally could not work. My mother was on her back all the time. She had a tracheotomy. She could barely lift her head. She was drugged up so much that she was usually asleep, usually. And when she wasn't asleep, she was so groggy that it was really difficult even to engage her in a conversation. My father, after he became bedridden, got severe dementia. And he believed all sorts of weird things about himself and about other people. For example, he believed he was a police officer. Before he was bedridden, he used to go around in his wheelchair, going into other people's rooms. He was in the dementia ward of um, an assisted living facility, a very nice one, by the way. They took really good care of him. But the dementia ward was on the third floor. The elevator was protected, meaning people could not get out. I have to admit, I was not happy about that. Um, I wanted to protest, but then I saw him and I realized, well, what else can they do? Before my father was bedridden, he would go around on the bottom floor and he would literally try to molest women. That's when his dementia started getting really bad. So then he went up to the third floor, started breaking into people's rooms and searching their rooms for alleged contraband, I guess. and then he became bedridden and he couldn't do anything. So when people are in a situation like that, obviously any compassionate society needs to take care of them. But those people, again, do not need an incentive to work because they can't work. So incentives only apply to people who are able to work. That's logical, right? I think anybody would agree that is logical. If you give people an incentive to work who can't work, it's not going to work. It doesn't matter. You can give somebody who is bedridden all the incentives you want, that person will still be unable to work. But the idea that many capitalists have is that if you don't hold out this carrot stick, if you don't throw, well, obviously I'm putting a negative spin on it, but if you don't throw breadcrumbs to the workers, they will not work. Well, that's a fallacy. That's an absolute fallacy. The majority of people with working class jobs do not like their work. They look forward to the weekends. The majority of people with working class jobs do not like their bosses. And if they could, they would fire their bosses. But obviously that's not possible. And so a lot of people who work are really, really alienated from their jobs. That's what capitalism does. Capitalism alienates workers. That's what Karl Marx said, right? Karl Marx talked about the tremendous alienation in the workplace that develops in capitalism. The solution to that is establishing communism. And again, in communism, you don't need to produce artificial incentives like throwing breadcrumbs at workers by these capitalists and their managers who basically are on the same side. You need to give people a reason to work, and that reason can only be that they have a share of ownership in the company. Now, when I talk about having a share of ownership, I am not talking about what capitalists call profit sharing, which is simply a trick. It's designed to make workers think that they have a share in the company, but they don't. And so they give their workers fancy titles like associates, right? And they say this is a worker-owned company. No, it isn't. It's a company which is still mostly owned by stockholders or mostly owned by the capitalists, but the workers get breadcrumbs. And so I guess they're entitled to be called associates because they associate with the capitalists on some weird level that nobody can really understand. No, you give people an incentive to work by making them the owners of the company. And obviously, if I have a share in the company that I am working at, then I will want to work because I'm happy, I'm doing what I want to do, and I actually am benefiting from the company making a profit. There's nothing wrong with companies making profits. Companies making profits is a fine idea. What matters is who owns the companies. Are the companies owned by the capitalists, or are they owned by the workers? So I used to have a discussion in my classes before I retired a lot of times, and I would sometimes say, well, of course, in communism, there will be companies. And once in a while, somebody would start laughing. And I would say, why are you laughing? And one response I got one time is, well, of course, there can't be any companies under communism. And I said, why not? He said, well, because in communism, everyone will simply get handouts. Nobody will have to work because the government will give people handouts. I said, where did you get that idea from? Well, invariably, it was from something like Fox News Channel or some other entity of a similar sort, or some right-wing newspaper. It certainly was not from a company or a publication that was acting in the interests of workers, because anybody that cares about workers would want to see workers be the owners of those companies. Now, do I think that any of this really matters for the first world? Yeah, I do. For as long as the first world exists, I would like to see collectivization, which is the name for what I've been talking about, right? Collectivization. I would like to see the workers be owners of the companies. Sure, sure. I would like that. But is that the same as communism? Not exactly, because if I operate a collective, but that collective is existing in an otherwise capitalist system, then it's not going to really fit in that well, or it's not going to really change the overall feeling or the overall comfort of society. Society will still be a company which is primarily driven by profit, not profit for the companies owned by workers, but profit for the capitalists. So having a few, I don't know, let's say a few food co-ops or a few credit unions, which are both examples of collectives here and there, is nice. I've always supported the idea of food co-ops, and I've also always supported the idea of credit unions. I think they are nice ideas, but having them within the framework of capitalism is the problem, because invariably they have a relatively minor role. I mean, the largest places where people deposit money are places like Bank of America, Chase, and whatever. It's not like, I mean, how many big credit unions are there? Credit unions are mostly local operations. There are no national credit unions because credit unions don't work that way. Credit unions are owned by the depositors. By definition, they are owned by the depositors. That's what a credit union is. And if you have a credit union, but that credit union is not owned by the depositors, then by definition, it's not a credit union, right? So it has to be owned by the depositors, in the same way that a food co-op needs to be owned by the people who actually contribute food to the food co-op and who purchase food from the food co-op. So That's, I think, a small adjustment which has been made actually to the first world, right? We see some collectives, some here and there, like food co-ops. We see credit unions, okay, some, but that's not enough. An entire society ultimately needs to be collectivized, meaning you can't have any capitalism in a true communist society, or else it's not communism, I guess. So communism is so radically different from capitalism that simple reform measures like collectivization on a small scale, like credit unions on a small scale, will simply not do the trick. You need a lot more. And that is why revolution is necessary. So to establish true communism, which would include collectivization, it may include food co-ops, it may include credit unions, I don't know. You need to have some kind of revolution. Now, does that revolution need to be violent? No, not necessarily. Revolution means a sudden change, just like evolution means a gradual change. Does that sudden change have to involve weapons and people fighting with each other? I would say ideally no. Ideally no. Now, might that happen? Yeah, it might happen. I can't predict the future. I would hope not. I would hope, for example, that the revolution, which will eventually, I hope, occur in the third world, will not involve violence, but will simply involve a transformation in the structure of power so that there are no more capitalists. And the capitalists are replaced by the workers. Now, is that going to happen? Again, I don't know. I can't know. Nobody can know because we're not prophets. We're not prognosticators. We're not futurists. You know, futurism tried for a long time to become a respected academic field, and it failed at every turn. Why? Because futurists are almost always wrong. I read some issues of, I believe it's called World Futurist Magazine or something like that, from several years ago, where it made predictions for now. Almost every single prediction it made was wrong. It never happened. It literally never happened. So I don't know what the future has in store for us, but I do know that the first world right now is not in a position to establish communism. The third world, I hope, will be. Why? Because, as I've said before, there have been communist revolutions, or at least communist revolutionary activity in the third world, in places, for example, like Mexico and like Iraq. Now, was that activity in the 21st century successful in the long term? No. Again, because it was too small. It was too small. Any successful revolution needs to be on a broad scale. It needs to involve all the workers, all the proletarian workers, meaning all the class-conscious workers. The lumpen proletarian workers or the workers without class consciousness, well, not much we can do about them for the time being. The subaltern, on the other hand, or the fourth world, they might be able to develop some kind of class consciousness and perhaps join the proletariat in revolution. I don't know, but I certainly think that is a possibility from observing, for example, mainland China and the kind of revolution that took place in mainland China. It was basically a peasant revolution. It was a revolution basically by the subaltern in China, by the fourth world in China. And they're the ones who successfully established communism in China, in mainland China. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, including the failed Cultural Revolution, communism in China did not last. And now China is back to being something else. I would call it a kind of, I guess, authoritarian capitalism, much as I would call modern day Russia an authoritarian capitalist system. So, do we have any successful models of societies to look at right now in the 21st century of where communism has been successful? No, we don't. But then again, look at capitalism, which is decaying day by day by day. The failures of the capitalist world system are self-evident. The alienation produced by capitalism is ubiquitous. There is no way to escape the fact that capitalism is not working right now. And so capitalism, which is really the first world, although there is capitalism in the third world too, but the base of capitalism is the first world. I mean, who runs the World Bank? The World Bank is basically run by the United States. It's not run by Latin America. It's not run by Asia. It's not run by the Caribbean. It's run by the US. What is the most powerful coalition in the world? It's NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So again, what we see is a failure of the first world, which is most starkly evident in the failures of capitalism. And all we can do, I think, is to hope that after the first world, after the capitalist world system, which is rooted in the first world, totally and completely collapses, which I think is only a matter of time, that a better system, a socialist system, a communist system in the third world will replace it. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Maoist Third Worldist Collective. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.